In this Blender tutorial, I'm going to walk you through step by step how to create a custom spray paint can with a procedurally generated texture for the label. This is a powerful technique that will save you time and will hopefully push you to think differently about making custom shaders. So just jumping right into Blender, the first thing I'm going to do is set an HDRI for the environment and double check my scene settings. You can go ahead and just pause the video now if you want to replicate these, but I find that these give me the best results with the least noisy image. When you start modeling, it's best to begin with a great set of reference images and a primitive object that most closely resembles your final product. I found this great portfolio that I'm going to use as a reference when I model my can. For the primitive, I'll start with a cylinder. By pressing Tab, you enter into edit mode, and you'll be able to edit this mesh. By just moving vertices and extruding positions, you quickly have the rough model completed. Basically, everything can be done with position, extrusion, and scale key bindings. When I get to the top, I'm going to be using a bevel to quickly get the general shape. It's not going to be perfect, but with a little manipulation, I can get the profile that I want. Just jumping between vertex, edge, and face modes really helps speed up your workflow while modeling. For the little cap on top, I'm starting with a narrow extrusion. Once it's roughly the correct size, you can copy the top edge loop, scale it up, and extrude that down. This will be that little cap on top. Duplicating this again, and we'll have the little spray tip. I forgot to finish the bottom, so using the same techniques as before, I added a little extra detail to the bottom. I used proportional editing at the bottom of the can as well as the spray tip. This gives a sphere of influence where our changes will take place. In this case, I'm able to add a spherical dip in the cap. Now that the general model is complete, I'm going to be scaling it down to be roughly the same size as a normal spray paint can. A quick Google search says that that's about 8.5 inches tall or 0.2 meters. Now just go ahead and apply your scale and the base mesh is done. For a game asset, I think you can call it quits here. But if you want an object that you can get a little bit closer to with the camera, we're going to be adding a subdivision surface modifier. Once applied, you'll notice that the mesh gets a little bit softer. It has to do with how the modifier averages vertex positions, but in edit mode, you can go over the entire mesh and just add edge loops, which are with Control R. For edges I want to sharpen, I add edge loops a little bit closer to that edge. At last, it's time to add materials. I use the ruler to get a rough estimate for the unwrapped dimensions. Every shape is different, but for a cylinder, it's easy to measure. Because I'm a psychopath, I am using After Effects to make the texture, but if you're more comfortable with Photoshop, by all means, you should definitely be using that. Before I add the materials and apply the subdivision modifier, it's best practice to duplicate my object and save it somewhere, just in case I want to change the base geometry later. The first material we'll make is the bare metal. This is going to be driven by a grunge image texture running through a color ramp node, as well as a bump node. Black is 100% glossy, and white is 100% roughness. By using a color ramp, this gives you way more freedom to customize the material's roughness. Now is a good time to let you know that you should enable the Node Wrangler add-on. This is done in the settings, and if you haven't done it already, it's highly recommended. It adds a bunch of convenient keyboard shortcuts to the shader editor to add a texture mapping node setup. I wasn't happy with the original UV unwrapping, so I did a cube projection, and that also didn't look great at all. Honestly, I am no expert in UV unwrapping, and so I just left it, but the goal is generally to have no visible seams or texture stretching, of which mine actually has both. In edit mode, I selected all of the faces I want to be the label, and added a new texture and selected Assign. In the shader editor, you can just drag and drop the label image in and link it to the base color. Back to UV unwrapping the label, I selected Cylinder UV Map and hit the toggle Scale to Bounds checkbox, which does a pretty good job of unwrapping the label. For the material, I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting, and typically that's done by adjusting roughness values. So I added a fingerprint texture and mixed that with the label color to create a roughness map that utilized both the black and white values of the label as well as the fingerprints. We're going to be coming back to a much more complicated version of the label later, but if you want a real simple outline, this is pretty nice. One thing I like to do right off the bat is to add some ambient occlusion. That's done by just using an ambient occlusion node mixed with a ramp node as well as a mixed shader node, where the second shader is going to be like a rough black color. When setting this up, I generally make the black color a really bright like pink color, so that way I can easily see which part is getting that like ambient occlusion grunge to it in the cracks. Once that's done though, I did also copy and paste that onto the metal material, so that way we got the ambient occlusion dirt in the crevices look for the metal as well. Moving on to the cap, I attempted to use a bump map to give the cap's little lines on it, but it honestly didn't look great, and in the future I would have probably just added the extra geometry, but from a distance I think it looks fine, so I left it. For the little nozzle, I just applied the label material to it and moved around the UVs so that there were black portions and white portions. It was a pain, but I think it did add a little bit of interest to the cap itself. With that, the basic materials are done. However, if you want to take this to the next level, let's make the shader procedural so that way every spray bottle is unique. This is a great way to quickly fill a scene with props without it looking too repetitive. Okay, so off screen, I added two extra nodes. One is a hue and saturation node in which I plugged the label color texture into. The other is the object info node, which includes a random output that I plugged into the hue of the hue saturation node as well as the position input for the fingerprint node. This makes the fingerprint location, as well as the color of the label, completely random. I wanted it to look like the user had paint on their hands and maybe they were using the can still. Since the color of the fingerprints should match the color of the paint, we need to pass the fingerprint texture through a color ramp node and make sure we change the colors to match the original color of the paint can. That way, when we use a random hue shift, it will change the hue of the paint can and the fingerprints together. Finally, we can add the wear and tear. On the principal BSDF for this new mix shader, we're going to set that to metallic. With another mix shader node, we'll be using the tiled scratch and grunge texture that we used for the other metal parts, but this time we're going to be using as the factor for the mix shader. We're going to be passing that again through a bump node, so that way we could add a little bit of depth to the scratches themselves. Pressing Ctrl-T with the scratch texture selected, it will automatically add the mapping node to it via the Node Wrangler plugin. And we're going to include the random output that we talked about earlier into this as well. So that way we get a completely random set of scratches every can as well. So finally, we end up with a shader that will produce a unique color, grunge texture, and spray paint fingerprints on it every single time. I've included the entire node setup on screen now, but if you'd like to download the project file and or support the channel, you could find it over on our Patreon at the $5 level. Don't forget to share your creations with us on Instagram and leave recommendations for video topics in the description. And by description, I mean the comments. I'm not going to redo this audio. Sincerely, thanks for watching.